Hey everybody, welcome back to the Fish Tank. It's time for our monthly chat about the Minion Masters Meta. Now, if you're new to this series, what I do is I record the leaderboards as we go through the month and then extrapolate that data, and then we'll have a look at what are the most played cards, decks, masters, I guess, from the leaderboard data. We don't have access to any hard data from behind the scenes through an API or anything, so the only thing we can do is look at the leaderboards, but that should give us a good idea of what's going on. And this one should be an interesting one. But before we get in there, let me just quickly remind you, if you're new to the Fish Tank, I would really appreciate it if you'd hit that subscribe button, give us a thumbs up, join us along on our Minion Masters journey. It's a lot of fun. Right, so, as mentioned, we're going to talk about the leaderboard. But there's some interesting things that we should mention before we go into that. So we are version 2.6. And 2.6 brought with it the alternative master perks. Now, there's been some bugs that have kind of made them awkward to use. There's also been not the most transparent way of knowing that they exist. So I don't know how many people are aware that the alternate master perks exist and how many are using them, but they're definitely there. And if you're not sure what the alternative master perks are, check out one of my videos talking about them in detail. So, the new master perks, and one thing I should mention there is I think we had a hotfix yesterday, so you should be able to set your perks with the default perk before you go into the match, so that should make them more accessible and more usable. Right, so we've got the new alt perks, we've got the new card, the Karmic, we're in the power up expansion. And of course, it'd be interesting to have a look at how the balance changes have affected the meta from last season. We've especially had some big reworks to, for example, to Setsu. So, without any further ado, let's jump in and start learning about this season. So, let's have a look at the master popularity to start with. So, this is the master popularity overall. So, each master has a bar. The yellow part of the bar is their 1v1, 2v2 random is the red, and 2v2 pre-mades are the blue part of it. So as we can see, this season, which is definitely new, Ratbo is overall the most played master, and we'll have a look in the next slide how that compares to last season, but Ratbo definitely wasn't. And Ratbo has seen the biggest increase since last season, going up 9% overall. APEP has dropped down a lot. APEP was the number one last time. APEP did get a little bit of a nerf in the last patch. The timers for the perk 1 and the perk 3 went up a couple of seconds. So that definitely affected APEP's strength overall. But as mentioned, the alternate master perks and the discussion that we've had seems that the perk 2 for Ratbo, the squeak attack where you get the burrowed scrats that do the extra damage, that's one of the strongest alternate master perks, and that's likely to get nerfed in the next patch, but that's definitely part of the reason why we're seeing a lot more Ratbo. And we can see there the sorry state of Setsu. Setsu did get a rework, but I think it definitely needs a buff. I'm behind the rework because it gets rid of some really awkward stun lock gameplay that is not fun to play into. But Setsu definitely needs something. So let's have a look at basically the same data as we've got here, but we're going to compare it to last season. So we'll see this format quite a lot. So the left pie chart is version 2.5 last season. The right pie chart is this season 2.6. So we can see last season APEP far and away the top played master, followed by Tronvir and Stormbringer. This season Ratbo is the number one master of choice. Just a reminder, we're looking at the overall here, so that's a combination of 1v1 randoms and pre-mades. So Ratbo followed by Valorian. Again, we're talking about the alternative master perks. Valorian's alternative perk 2, the Fervent Warrior, another one of the very strong perks that we've seen introduced to the game, and possibly would get a nerf, although the devs data is not suggesting that that's actually as strong as people think, but we'll see what happens there. So Ratbo went up a lot this season, Valorian, and of course what goes up, something has to come down. Apep, as we mentioned, dropped off a lot. Tronvir also dropping off a lot. Now, Tronvir, as with all the Masters, did get a new alt perk, but the Tronvir alt perk is probably amongst the worst, and we're likely to see a buff for that in the future. Setsu dropped off a little bit, not a huge amount, but still, you know, Setsu wasn't played very much. It is played even less now, unfortunately. So we'll see what happens with Setsu in the future. Right, so just to reiterate, Masters of Choice so far this season: Ratbo, Valorian, and Stormbringer. Apep down there in 4th. But let's break that down a little bit through the different modes, because some Masters are much better in certain modes than others. So first of all, let's have a look at our solos, 1v1. So again, last season on the left, Apep, hugely dominant. This season, Valorian is the Master of Choice. And I do believe that is at least partially, but maybe primarily due to the new alternate Master perk. Now, we don't have any data really for the alternate Master perks. We can't tell from the decks what perks are being used. Perhaps in the future, if the devs do introduce that into the leaderboard, if it shows what perks they're using, then maybe we can extrapolate that data and use it. But at the moment, we don't have anything to directly talk about that. But so we can see Valorian, Apep dropped a lot, but still the second favourite. Morelia has gone up a lot. So Morelia has seen the biggest uptake in solos. Why is that? Not really sure. Morelia's alt perk doesn't seem to be very good, so it's probably nothing to do with that. But it's maybe to do with Apep getting nerfed, as we mentioned about, and people just wanting to try other things. Right, so Valorian, Apep, Morelia, followed by Milloween. Those are the top 3/4 Masters in solos. And again, if we have a look at the average mana cost, it hasn't changed from last season to this season. And when we're talking to newer players and we're speaking about deck building and what should your mana cost be, your average mana cost, you're looking between 3 at the lowest and 4.5 at the highest. Obviously, there's exceptions to some of those, but generally that's the sort of average mana cost you want, and you want a nice mana curve. And when we talk about a mana curve, that's having options of different mana expense, so you can react appropriately. Right, so let's move on to have a look at the randoms popularity. So randoms, last season, Apep #1, Tronvir, and then Morelia. This season, Ratbo. And Ratbo seems to be a lot more potent in 2s, 2v2 randoms and 2v2 premates. So Ratbo has gone up hugely compared to last season. And just to reiterate, that is very likely to do with his alternate master perk. So Ratbo, Morelia, and Milloween, the top 3. But if we look at the Masters that have seen increases, Ratbo's the most. Mordar's seeing more play. Not really sure if that's to do with Mordar's alternate Master perk, the Tomb of the Deathless. I haven't seen too many people playing that in my experience, so I'm not sure if that's really going to be affecting that. Valorian's gone up as well. Milloween. A lot of people seem to think that the Milloween alternate master perk, the Zanian Spellbook, is very, very strong. Where you get the 4 different spells of 4 different types, and you get it for cheap. So that could definitely have seen an increase. Stormbringer's gone up a little bit, but again, unlikely to do with the alternate master perk, because his perk's kind of awful. But of course, if Ratbo's being played a lot more, what is being played a lot less? Tronvir. Tronvir has dropped off hugely. Last season in randoms, he was the second most popular. Now he's down amongst the least popular. So Tronvir, Apep, and Morelia dropping off a lot. And unfortunately, of course, Setsu dropping out there. Average mana cost a little bit more expensive in 2s than in solos. You can get away with heavier decks. But not much has changed. 3.8 versus 3.7 of last season. Okay, let's have a look at pre-mades. So, pre-mades last season. On the left, Tronvir, Apep, and Stormbringer. But now, Ratbo is the #1, Stormbringer second, and interestingly, Volko is third. The jury's kind of still out on the power of the Volko alternate perk. That's his perk 3, where he gets the 10 mana over 10 seconds, I think. and the Embers, the Endless Rage, something like that I think it's called. I'm not sure how impactful that is, but Volko's always been decent in 2s. But again, if we look at the increases, Ratbo's gone up a lot, Volko's gone up a decent amount, Ravager as well. Ravager's kind of an interesting one, not sure which of the perks people are using, but his ult perk is to replace the first Brutus, the perk 1 Brutus, with the Overpower, where your 5+ mana minions get an empowered first attack. So that's kind of an interesting one, because you have the Brutus, which is a one-time only perk, being replaced by something that lasts throughout the game. And the consensus is kind of, some people think that that's strong, others don't. Right, so again, if Ratbo's been played a lot more, what is being played a lot less? And again, it's Tronvir. Tronvir really dropping off. Dominant last season. Now he's only the 4th top master in pre-made. So Tronvir, Apep, and King Puff dropping off overall. And then the last thing we'll do to look at the master popularity is we'll look at it in draft. Now, draft is separate to all the other stats. This is not included in the overall stats, since draft is a little bit different because you don't have the full freedom of choice. But again, last season, Tronvir and Apep dominant. Tronvir dropping off a lot. So this season, the top played or chosen draft masters, Apep, Valorian, and Tronvir. And remember, draft is the mode where you get choices to build your deck. You get 3 masters to choose from, and then 3 choices for each card. So we can get some information as long as we have enough decks to look at from the leaderboard for draft. But we've got to consider the restrictions that are imposed on the draft mode. Rect seeing a decent amount more play. Valorian and Diona. Tronvir dropping off a lot. Apep and Milloween a little bit. So Apep, Valorian, Tronvir, your draft masters of choice. And just to talk about how useful these draft stats potentially be, or could be, I've done 2 draft runs where I selected the highest rated master and the highest rated cards from my data in each selection. Ignored completely any sort of synergy requirements, any sort of deck requirements like wanting spells or anything like that. So just using the hard data. I did 2 draft runs and won all of my matches. Got 2 12-0 draft victories using this data, even with completely unbalanced decks. I had one that had 0 anti-air apart from the master. Still crushed everyone. So interesting that data could be very useful. Right, next up we're going to have a look at the rarity composition. If you're new to Minion Masters, there's 4 card rarities. Green is common, blue is rare, pink, purple is supreme, and yellow, orange, whatever you want to call it, is legendary. But one thing to know if you're new to Minion Masters is the rarity of a card doesn't really reflect its strength, it's more about its uniqueness. That's why you don't see a deck full of legendary cards, because they just don't work. So you can see here that the decks are mostly comprised of common and rare cards, some supreme and some legendary. So it's always worth remembering that, especially if you're a new player. You don't have to run out and get all sorts of legendaries to build a deck with. Some of the most basic cards, and we'll see in a minute when we look at the most played cards, we'll see that most of them, and it normally turns out that most of them are just common cards. So that's a really nice part of this game, and it's a really strong argument to show it to people when they're like, oh, this game's pay to win. It really isn't. Okay, faction composition. Right, we've got factions in the game. How many are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Right, we've got 9 different factions. So this just gives us an idea overall which faction cards are being played the most. So we've still got Voidborn being played the most overall. So a reminder, these are not faction decks. These are just faction cards overall. So we've got Voidborn, we've got Scrat. Empyrean has increased a little bit, switching with Accursed in 4th place. Zenchi's gone up a bit. Might be due to the new Karmic card, which is a Zenchi card, and it's quite popular. So that could definitely affect that. So, for example, we saw a big uptake in the Scrats recently because the Wartrack Dreadnought was everywhere. But as that's been nerfed, as we've been seeing it being played less, then there's less kind of scrat cards overall. So the biggest increases are with the Empyreans and the Zenchi, and the biggest decreases scrat and accursed. Right, let's break this down a little bit, see if there's anything different between the different modes when we talk about the factions. So a lot of charts here. So the top row are current season 2.6, the different modes, and the bottom row are last season. I know the labels are kind of small, but hopefully the colours should make sense. So if we look at solos this season, so Voidborn, Empyrean, and Slither. And it's interesting to see here that Slither's quite popular in solos, but not very popular comparatively in randoms or premates. So if we look at the movers and the shakers, we've seen some big increases in solos to Empyrean. They're now the second played faction in solos. And Scrat dropping off quite a lot from the previous season. Randoms, again, Empyrean's gone up. Accursed dropping off quite a lot, and Scrats. And in premates, Zenchi has been going up quite a lot, and Voidborn dropping off. So, Voidborn, Empyrean, Slither for solos, Voidborn, Accursed, Scrat for randoms, and Scrat, Voidborn, and Outlander for premates. Okay, moving on from the factions, let's have a look at the wildcard usage. Now, wildcards allow you to use duplicates. So you can have 3 copies of 1 card or 2 copies of 2 cards. I know most of these graphs are nonsense, but I love including them to remind ourselves of what's going on. So no wildcards in solos. That's been the way for a while. And was it in version 2.5, wildcards were removed from premates. So wildcards only exist in randoms. I still do feel like they're problematic in randoms. I would like to see them removed overall. But you can see not too much has changed. 56% of random decks without wildcards, 24% with 1, and 19% with 2 wildcards. But which cards are used the most? Skeleton Crew, still massively wildcarded. Even though it was reduced, because they did nerf it in the last patch, they did reduce one of the copies, but you can still have 2 copies overall, 1 wildcard of it. And it's wildcarded 5 times as much as the next one. So Skeleton Crew, Scrat Tank, Elite Swarmer, and Swarmers. Interesting to see their very basic cards being wildcarded. And it just gives you the strength for the bridge grab, some cheap tanks. We're not seeing people wildcarding these super legendary cards, things like that. And really one of the reasons why the Skeleton Crew is so strong is because of the new bridge changes, where you can place units on the bridge to take them if they have that horizontal spread, which the Skeleton Crew does. And the reason the Skeleton Crew is much better at it than others is because the skeletons are quite tanky compared to things like Scrats. And they move slowly, or they're spread out quite a lot, so you can take a bridge even if you're going to walk backwards. Right, so those are the wildcards. Reminder, wildcards are bad. So the next thing we're going to look at are the top cards overall. So if you're a new player, you're looking to build a deck, you're looking to craft some stuff, this will give you a good idea of what's going on. Now, there's a lot of data, and as I always say, we do cover a lot in these videos, so if you need to rewatch it, pause it, screenshot, whatever you need to do to get the most use out of it, please feel free to do so. Right, so we do have a little legend here. So if a card has a green border, that means its rank's gone up from last season. If it's a red border, it's gone down. If it's white, that means it's a new card. And if it's black, that means it's stayed in the same position. Each card has 2 numbers. The top left number is its current position. The top right number is its previous position. So if we look at the first card, the Swarmers, its current position is 1. Its previous position is 2. That means it went up, so it's green. So a lot of cards here that we're probably familiar with seeing, and a lot of basic cards. As mentioned, out of the top 17 cards here, sorry, the top 27 cards, 17 are common, 5 are rare, only 3 are supreme, and only 2 are legendary. The two legendaries are the Chief Icebreaker both there in 21st position, and the Wartrack Dreadnought. And it's definitely worth mentioning there, the Wartrack Dreadnought down in 23rd position, down from 1st position last month, and its play rate has dropped a lot. So if we look at the cards that increased a lot overall, Crossbow Clubhouse has had the biggest increase. Remember, that did get a buff last season. And if you watch my patch notes video from last season, when we talked about that buff, you may have heard me mentioning that this may be a buff too far because it's had a lot of buffs, and that seems like it might be the case. Also, it has been noticed there is a bit of a bug with the Crossbow Clubhouse where most, or not, if all other buildings, you can't place them right up close to the edge of the arena. They have what's called a building aura around them, a placement aura. For some reason, that's missing on the Crossbow Clubhouse, so you can play it right up against the bridge, right up against the middle, which actually kind of makes it better than it should be. So I look forward to that getting bug fixed, and that should make it less strong, but it's probably going to need a nerf as well to reduce some of the buff that it got in the last patch. Haunting Huggers also seeing a lot more play, and Annihilator, which is kind of interesting. Annihilator is quite a heavily played card, not necessarily in the leaderboard, but definitely in the just overall in the game. Annihilator, I've heard the devs say it's the most played card before, but it is still heavily played, up to 17th from 46 from last season. Now, one thing I always find interesting is there's 291 cards in Minion Masters now. And from our leaderboard data, every single one of those cards appeared on the leaderboard, which I think is really interesting from a balance point of view. It's not like there's only 25% of the cards we see on the leaderboard. Every single one of them was used, but there was one card used less than everything else. There was one card that was used only 3 times. Pause the video now. Let me know in the comments, what do you think the least played card was? Now, one thing we haven't really done in the past, but I think it might be interesting to do here, is just to have a look at how the buffs from last season have potentially, or not the buffs, but the balance changes overall have affected the play rate of these cards. So, as mentioned, the Crossbow Clubhouse buffed last season. It's been played 31 times as much. Frostberry Bearer got buffed last season. It's been played 10 times as much. Frost Feathers got a little buff, 2.6 times as much. The Highland Huntress, again, got a little buff, 4.5 times the play rate from before. Netherstep, 2.5 times the play rate. Null Matrix, 2.3 times the play rate, and it's still bugged. Maybe that'll get fixed at some point. The Protocol Assassin, the play rate's actually gone down, even though it got a buff, but the buff was it getting partially getting extra speed, which is not necessarily great. Rampant Growth has gone up 50 times. Screaming Scrat's gone up 1.3 times. Stormy's gone up 11 times. And Urklaw, despite getting a buff, is still being played about the same, which I'm kind of surprised about because I feel like I've seen it a lot more. We did have a couple of reworks. The Scrat Launcher, now it's only a 3 mana card, does less damage, but that's still being played as much as it was before. And the Zeppelin Bomber did kind of get a buff, but it's dropped off a lot. And then if we look at the nerfs, Bounce Breath Flinger's got a little nerf, hasn't changed their play rate at all, primarily because they still do what they did before. They still give you the shroom for cheap. That's all you really want. Netherbat's got a nerf. Their play rate's dropped down to 0.6 times its previous. Skeleton Crew did get the nerfs, as we spoke about when we talked about the wildcards, but their play rate actually went up. Slitherbound got a slap on the wrist. Their play rate went down a little bit. They're likely to get nerfed in the next patch. Unholy Ground hasn't really changed much. Wartrack Dreadnought has dropped, only being played 1/3 as much as it was previously. So, just give you an idea there that it seems like overall cards that got buffed are played more, cards that got nerfed are played less. Right, moving on. So we finished here with the top cards. We're going to break this down a little bit. We're going to look at the top cards in the different modes, and we're going to start off with the non-spells. And I think it's important to split the spells and the non-spells, because normally when you're building a deck, you might think, okay, I want 2 spells, so then you deal with the spells and then you fill out the rest of it with the minions. So I think that's minion stroke building, so I think it makes sense. And to no one's surprise, the number 1 card in solos is the Zealots of the Burning Fist. Again, a card that's likely to get nerfed in the next patch, but it is very, very strong. We can see last season it was the top 3 card, now it's the top 1 card, and that's really comes to no one's surprise, I would imagine, if you've been following kind of the solo meta. Lots of cards that we're very familiar seeing there. Crossbow Clubhouse, as mentioned, 6th place, up from 176. So that's come out of nowhere, having almost no play to being almost in all of the decks. And the Zealots actually being played more than they were last season, despite a lot less Wartrack Dreadnought. Wartrack dropped off a lot. The biggest decrease in 1v1 cards was the Wartrack Dreadnought. The Zealots were a great counter to that, but people are realizing, well, there's no Dreadnought, but still the Zealots are great. And we look at randoms. We've spoken about the Skeleton Crew multiple times, but there you can see top card in randoms, 6th previous, got a little bit of a nerf. But the thing that didn't really affect it was the part of the nerf to the Skeleton Crew was it's a Cursed Ascension buff, which most people, I think that's probably fair to say, are playing this outside of a Cursed deck, which is kind of crazy. That just shows you how strong it is. Elite Swarmer, always a familiar card up there. Grenadier again. So once we look at 2v2s compared to solos, you start finding things that do AoE damage, area of effect, things that are good at dealing with lots of other things, or big units become more valuable. So there we see, for example, the Whirly Scrat. That's a real valuable clear. The Grenadier, as we mentioned. Cursebearer is great against big units. Again, the Annihilator there in pre-mades. That's a good AoE unit, ground and air. And Tantrum Throwers in the top 3 of all of these. The top 9 of all of these. And Tantrum Throwers, again, another great card because you can play them on the bridge. And especially if you have both bridges and they get the spear, the time it takes them to throw that spear, that will give you enough time to capture the bridge, even if they're walking backwards. So Tantrum Throwers, very, very strong overall. So we mentioned that Crossbow Clubhouse, the play rate's gone up a lot in solos. If we look at the play rates for things going up and down in the 2v2 modes, Shield Guard of Light seeing quite a big increase in randoms, along with Annihilator. And as we saw before, Wartrack Dreadnought, the biggest decrease in randoms and the biggest decrease in pre-mades. And the overall top non-spell cards, Swarmers, followed by Elite Swarmer, followed by Tantrum Throwers, followed by Skeleton Crew, and then Plasma Marine. Again, reminder, most of those, if not all of them, are very basic cards, easy to craft. If you're new to the game, these are cards that you should definitely get, and you can include in all sorts of different decks. Right, so that's the non-spells. Let's look at the spells. So, of course, there's different types of spells, but most of the spells we see most commonly are removal spells. So we look in solos, Daggerfall still the number 1 spell of choice. Chain Lightning's had a bit of an uptick, up to 2nd from 5th. Unholy Ground still there in 3rd. Beam of Doom is kind of an interesting one because Beam of Doom's a heavy removal spell, which you expect to see more in 2v2 randoms or pre-mates, but it definitely has a place in solos as a sort of a get out of jail, not free card, but a get out of jail card. Sometimes you'll hold it and not use it, other times it will save you over and over again. So if we look at the change in play rates, Chain Lightning has seen the biggest increase in solos. Snap Freeze has gone up a lot. Snap Freeze is currently bugged, though. It freezes for 6 seconds instead of 4 for some reason. That definitely needs to be fixed. Black Hole seeing more play as well, which is kind of interesting. And then if we look at the randoms, Arcane Barrage seeing a lot more play, which it didn't get buffed in the last patch, but I think it did get buffed fairly recently. But it's gone up from 52nd overall to 7th, so quite a lot there. Bevalanche is the removal spell of choice in randoms, but it is in the top 9 of all of them. Bevalanche is a really strong spell and almost an auto-include in a lot of people's decks. Not only is it first in randoms, it's seen a big uptick in play. Bladestar dropping off quite a lot. And from my experience with Bladestar, and the reason that I've been playing it less, is because a lot of people, as we saw from the Masters, a lot of people are playing Ratbow. And Bladestar is really awkward to play when the opponents have a lot of these little scrats, these hidden scrats all over the place. It makes it very difficult to get the Bladestar where you want it. And I think, personally for me, and probably for others, that's why the Bladestar has dropped off from play rate quite a lot. So a Chain Lightning dropping off in randoms as well, which is kind of interesting, but still a heavily played card. And if we look in pre-mades, see Chain Lightning dropping off in randoms, but going up both in pre-mades and solos. Who knows why? Seeing a lot more Spirit Infusion in pre-mades, and Beam of Doom dropping off. Was the #1 pre-made spell? Not anymore. And then we just remind ourselves, overall, Bevalanche, #1 spell, very closely followed by Daggerfall, then pretty closely followed by Chain Lightning, Unholy Ground, and Beam of Doom. So if you're looking to build a deck and you're thinking, what spells should I put in, this is a great place to start if you've got access to them. And a lot of these spells are just basic cards, easy to get. Right, next up we'll look at the Legendaries. Now, we spoke earlier about how you don't need a deck full of Legendaries, but most decks have at least 1 or 2 Legendaries in. Some of the Legendaries are kind of just general, strong Legendaries that you can have in all sorts of decks, whereas some of them are really specific Legendaries with synergy that you want to sort of build around. And interesting to see in solos, Talok is the #1 choice, up from 3rd last season, and that's had the biggest increase in play rate. And Talok is one of those that he definitely does need some synergy, probably some Slither synergy, with the poison, him doing his double damage, and Talok is likely to get a nerf in the next patch, because he is very, very strong. Dreadnought's still up there when we're looking at the highest played Legendaries in solos, but down from 1st to 2nd, but it has dropped off massively. Like last season it was massively 1st, now it's only 2nd. So although it's up there, it has dropped off a huge amount. And we see the new Karmic card. It's in the top 9 of all of the different modes, and that's interesting to see. I don't think Karmic's OP. I don't think he necessarily needs some work, but he's definitely good. And he's one of those cards we've seen in all of the modes. Has a decent attack. It actually does, you can't tell it from reading his card, but he actually does 3 little attacks for each attack, which means he's great at dealing with Horde. Of course, if you play him correctly or get some luck, you have that Karmic Shield to return a huge amount of damage. We've seen Cleavers hit him, we've seen Blue Golems hit him, and he does. If you get that timing right, and it does require a little bit of luck, then you can get that huge value from him. Right, so we're seeing quite a lot of Mardred being played more in solos. As we mentioned, Wartrack dropping off a lot, Musketeer dropping off decently, same with Bara in solos. Fergus getting a bit of an uptick in randoms. He has gone up to 2nd from 1st. I feel like Reckonator might need a little bit of balance, because definitely seeing a lot of him. Reckonator might be one of those cards that you just need no wild cards. I say it all the time. Just remove wild cards from everything, and so many balance issues go away. So big increases, as said, to Fergus. Also the Veilstalker, which some people, like Jackia, think the Veilstalker is awful, but I think if you play the Veilstalker or against the Veilstalker in 2v2, it can be really oppressive. It's really annoying to keep track of when there's a lot going on. it can get a lot of value, whether that's AoE killing a lot of stuff, or whether that's just being annoying and forcing you to wait for it. So I think that's a much better card than some people give it credit for. If we look at pre-mades, Rimmergal's there in 8th place, up from 41st. That's seen the biggest increase. Shumama Shumi, not quite in the top 9, but that's seen a big increase. Lady in Frey. Lady in Frey is one of those cards, again, I feel like she needs either some kind of rework or her wild cards being removed, because her piercing infinite range, I think, is just too strong. Again, if we look at pre-mades, Wartrek Dreadnought is up there in 2nd place, but it has seen a huge reduction. We're seeing less Lord Fanriel in pre-mades, and I wonder if that's potentially because of the way that the new bridges work and the fact you can't cap a bridge with the charge in Fanriel. Right, and the last thing I want to look at for this section is we're going to have a look at the top cards for draft. Again, this is completely separate to all the other data since it's a completely different game mode. But again, if you're building a draft deck, these should be, if you get given these as options, they should be almost sort of auto-includes. So Propeller Scrats, Shielded Crossbow Dudes, Bats, really strong in draft. And the reason some things are stronger in draft is because some things need specific counters, and you're less likely to run into those specific counters in draft. So, for example, we talk about, let's talk about something like a Harbinger. Most people, if they build a balanced deck in ranked mode, will have a way of dealing with a Harbinger, whether that's removal spells or allowing it to come close to them and using their anti-air. Whereas in draft, you can't count on having those options available to you. So that's why some things are stronger in draft than in just regular constructed gameplay. Karmic, again, we're seeing him all over the place. Nice to see a new card that's decently played, but not horrifically OP. Okay, so we've looked at the Masters and we've looked at the cards. Let's put those together and look at the top decks. So you can argue what is or isn't a top deck. So basically what I've done here is I've looked at the decks that were top or around the top of the leaderboard, and then I've ranked them based on the rankings of the cards that they have within them. So we're looking at the high ranked decks with the low ranked cards. Does that make sense? I think if you follow it along, it kind of makes sense. And then we've just had a look at the different Masters of Choice, because, for example, there's been a lot of Valorian decks. But we have a lot of... we've got 5 different Masters here, just to add a bit of just interest and a difference. So we can see a lot of the common cards we saw when we looked at the top cards. Daggerfall, Removal of Choice in solos, and there we can see it in all the top 5 decks. Woggosaur Pup, again, that's likely to be a card that gets nerfed in the next patch. Crossbow Clubhouse in 3 of those. We see the Zealots making a big play. Wrecked, I've tried this Wrecked deck. The 2nd place deck is a Inabisia deck, a JF deck, and it's very strong for sure. Played it. I don't think I lost a game with it, but I didn't play it for too long. But I really like it because it's like a real nice control deck. It's very cheap, lots of cheap cards. It's all about just playing quickly, getting the value from your cheap cards, holding the pressure on the bridges. And one of the things that really allows you to do that is the Crossbow Clubhouse. Ratbow is up there in 3rd place. And as you can see here, this is a Ratbow without a lot of little horde cards, which suggests that this is a Ratbow using the alternate master perk. No Daka, but these burrowed Scrats. Rockin' Roller is kind of an interesting inclusion there, because you're kind of playing a deck that has lots of little cheap control, but then if your opponent commits with a big chunk of units, maybe like we see a lot of the Stout Hearts play together, for example, Rockin' Roller comes in and crushes them. So we can see here that most of these decks are cheap control decks with some power cards. Right, so those are the solo decks. If you're looking to get involved into solo gameplay, these will definitely give you a good start. Of course, some of the masters are easier to use than the others, so see how you get on. Right, next up, top 2v2 random decks. So again, as we mentioned before, once we get into 2v2 territory, cards that can deal with lots of units at the same time become more valuable. Area of effect minions, stroke spells become more valuable. So there we see Beam of Doom, for example. That's a great area of effect spell. Blade Star, pretty powerful. And then we see more expensive cards. Shield Guard of Light, I've been playing him a lot this season. I think he's a great card. Lots of value you can get from him. His charge is great for getting on the bridges, knocking things away. Okay, so the top deck, the Rat Bow, again, doesn't have too much Horde in it, so it's probably using the alternate perk. Has the wild-carded Skeleton Crew, which is kind of a little bit cringe, but gives you an idea of people using the Skeleton Crew to good effect outside of a curse decks. So you can see a lot of these decks will have a lot of cheap cards, and then they'll have their power cards that they can cycle through to quickly. So we've got Rat Bow, we've got Milloween. Again, Milloween probably using the alternate master perk, the Zanian spellbook, because it is just really good. If you're able to make quick decisions, decide what you want to do in a decent manner, then it can be great for you. King Puff, always a strong choice. Propeller Horde, always see that in a King Puff deck. Lots of Horde to trigger it. I haven't really seen too many people playing the King Puff alt perk. Might get a buff in the next patch. Morelia, and again, interesting to see a Morelia deck because, you know, people see a Morelia and they think immediately accursed. But you can see here, this is not an accursed deck at all. And then we have a very sort of different deck here, the Commander Azali Diona deck with Mana Puff Madness. One of those cards that can be great or awful. But you've got to use them at the right time. So clearly the idea here is to get sort of a push going to get Commander Azali on the field, and then you've got the Mana Puffs. You've got the ability to shield them with Commander Azali. You've got the Veilstalker, which is great to jump onto the bridge to kill the opponent's puffs. You've got the Spirit Mancer, which is great. You can sometimes just hoover up all the puffs. I don't think puffs trigger the Spirit Mancer's Soul Rip. Soul Rip, giving spirits because they're puffs. But some interesting different decks there. And then finally we'll close out our deck section with looking at the pre-mades. One thing we need to consider when pre-mades is we're looking at decks that play with other decks. Some of these will have specific decks they play with. Others might play with lots of different people. So again, we see Rat Bow at the top there. Again, not a Horde Rat Bow, so using the alt perk. But Wartrack Dreadnought's still seeing play up there. And I think when we see the Dreadnought, we now rarely see anyone play it at perk 1, perk 2 more often, and definitely at perk 3. Right, King Puff doing King Puff things. Again, Valorian probably using the alt perk, but we're not sure. Stormbringer, as you would expect, with lots of ranged units. And Ravager, which we can't tell which perk, but let's pretend they're using the new perk to good effect. And we see a lot of Curse Bearers there. Curse Bearers great against big units, of course. That Curse doing 3% damage every second to everything around it. One thing to note with the Curse Bearer, and this is a mistake I see a lot of people make, is they use the Curse Bearer as a tank, which ideally you don't want to, because if you use it as a tank against a dragon, for example, sure, it's going to do a lot of curse damage, but it's going to die. If you can tank the dragon with something else, keep the Curse Bearer alive. Keep that curse alive for as long as possible and get huge value out of it. Right, the next section we're going to go through, which is the final section, and we're going to go through it quickly because I know these videos are kind of long. Looking at the time of the recording, it's getting kind of out of control, but there's a lot of data that we have to go through. We're going to look at the cards that are most played with each master. Now I'm going to zip through these, so if you want to just print screen, pause the video, whatever you want to do. So these are the top APEP cards. One thing to note is look at the number of decks at the bottom. That gives you an idea of is it a good representative sample or not, because some masters are played a lot less than others. Right, APEP. These are the top APEP cards. Diona. King Puff, and we start to see more Horde for the perk 3 value. Milloween, we see some more spells, of course, for the spell synergy, and some more Accursed there, especially in solos. Mordor, we start seeing bigger units for those good revives. Morelia seems to be Accursed dominated in 2v2s, but definitely not in solos. Although there is Toll of the Dead there, so that suggests that it's still alive and kicking. Wrecked, pretty aggro master. Ratbow used to be always dominated by the mass Horde cards, but of course with the alternate master perk, not necessarily anymore. Ravager, again, a very aggro master. Setsu, more spell synergy, but if you look at the number of decks at the bottom, you can see that Setsu's hardly played at all, so it doesn't really give us too much information. Stormbringer, as always, we'll see the ranged units, whether that's from the Crystal Elves or from the Outlanders. Tronvir just plays whatever, really. Glorian always seems to have an Empyrean impact there. And finally, Bolko. Right, we did it. These videos getting too long? Let me know. Are we going through too much information? Would you prefer it to be broken down a little bit into multiple videos, or is the stuff that we talk about that we don't need to cover? I don't know. But it's a lot of work that I put in to get this data, so I do try to get as much information out of it as possible. As I mentioned at the start, if you are new to Minion Masters, if you're not subscribed here in the fish tank, it would put a smile on my face if you take a second out of your busy day to give us a subscribe. If you enjoyed the video and it's helped you out, give us a thumbs up, and I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Let me know, what are you seeing out there? Does it reflect what we're seeing? Are the things you want buffed? Are the things you want nerfed? Did I get anything wrong? Did I get anything right? I don't know. Let me know. But that's everything that I wanted to cover today. My name's Bad as a Fish, and I'll see you again soon here in the fish tank.